St. Matthew's Church had never looked more beautiful. Sunlight poured through the tall stained-glass windows, casting soft colors across polished wooden pews. White roses lined the aisle in perfect symmetry, their scent delicate and controlled. Nothing overwhelming, nothing out of place. Everything about the setting felt intentional, curated, almost too perfect. Guests filled the room with quiet admiration. Women leaned toward one another, whispering compliments about the decorations. Men adjusted their jackets, nodding approvingly. This wasn't just a wedding. It was the kind of event people talked about long after it ended. At the center of it all stood Jonathan Reeves. Tall, composed, and sharply dressed in a tailored black suit, Jonathan carried himself with quiet confidence. He wasn't just successful, he was admired. A self-made businessman who had built his reputation on discipline and control, he was known for making the right decisions, for seeing things clearly when others could not. Today, however, there was something softer in his expression. Nervous anticipation. His best man, Daniel Harper, leaned in slightly and murmured, "You good?" Jonathan exhaled, a faint smile forming. "Yeah, I'm good. He paused, glancing toward the entrance. "Feels real now." Daniel chuckled. "That's because it is." A few rows back, Emily's mother, Linda Carter, dabbed at the corner of her eyes with a tissue. "She's waited so long for this," she whispered to a relative beside her. "She deserves this happiness." No one disagreed. Emily Carter had always been reserved. Kind, polite, but distant in a way that made people curious. She never spoke much about her past, never lingered too long in conversations about herself. But she listened, always listened, and when she smiled, it felt genuine. That was enough for most people. And for Jonathan, it had been everything. The music began, soft piano notes filling the church, steady and familiar. Conversations faded instantly. Every head turned toward the back. Then she appeared. Emily stood at the entrance, framed by light. Her dress flowed elegantly, simple but refined, the fabric catching the sunlight in a way that made her seem almost unreal. Her dark hair was styled neatly, resting just above her shoulders, and her makeup was subtle, highlighting rather than hiding. She looked perfect. For a moment, Jonathan forgot to breathe. As Emily began walking down the aisle, her eyes locked onto his. There was warmth there, but also something else, something faint, almost imperceptible. A hesitation, a flicker of uncertainty that passed so quickly it could have been imagined. Jonathan smiled anyway. "You're here," he whispered under his breath, barely audible. Emily's lips parted slightly as she approached. When she finally reached him, she let out a quiet breath, as if she had been holding it the entire walk. "You look beautiful," Jonathan said, his voice low but steady. Emily gave a small smile. "So do you." Her hands trembled, just slightly, as she placed them into his. Jonathan noticed. "Hey," he said gently, tightening his grip just enough to steady her. "It's okay. We're here now." Emily nodded, but her eyes dropped for a brief second before returning to his. "Yeah, we are." The officiant, Reverend Collins, stepped forward, his voice warm and practiced. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to witness the union of two souls." His words flowed smoothly, familiar and comforting. The guests settled into stillness, absorbed in the ceremony. The atmosphere felt sacred, almost untouched by the outside world. A beginning, a promise, a future being quietly written in real time. Jonathan listened, but only partially. His attention kept drifting back to Emily. Her expression, her posture, the way her fingers felt colder than he expected. "You sure you're okay?" he whispered, just as the officiant paused between lines. Emily forced a soft laugh, barely more than a breath. "Just nerves." Jonathan studied her face for a moment longer than necessary. Then he nodded. "Okay." From the outside, everything remained flawless. A perfect bride, a perfect groom, a perfect moment. But beneath the surface, buried deep in the quiet spaces between words and glances, something fragile was already beginning to crack. And no one in that room, not even Jonathan himself, understood just how quickly perfection could fall apart. The ceremony continued, smooth and uninterrupted, at least on the surface. Reverend Collins spoke with steady rhythm, his voice echoing gently through the church. "Marriage is built on trust, honesty, and the willingness to stand fully known before one another." Jonathan's gaze remained fixed on Emily, but something in him had shifted. It was subtle, almost instinctual, the kind of feeling he couldn't immediately name, but couldn't ignore either. Emily's hands were still in his, but they felt colder now. Not just nervous cold, something deeper, unsettling. Her grip tightened, then loosened, then tightened again, as if she were trying to steady herself from within. "You're okay," Jonathan whispered under his breath, more to reassure himself than her. Emily nodded quickly. "I'm fine." But she didn't meet his eyes this time. A few rows back, a woman in a pale blue dress shifted in her seat. She frowned slightly, leaning closer to her husband. "Do you smell that?" she whispered. He blinked, confused. "Smell what?" She hesitated. "I don't know, something's off." He inhaled quietly, then shook his head. "Probably the flowers." Maybe it was. White roses, lilies, polished wood. There were plenty of scents in the room. Easy to dismiss. Easy to explain. But the woman didn't look convinced. Near the aisle, another guest subtly pressed a hand to her nose, glancing around as if trying to locate the source without drawing attention. A faint tension began to ripple outward, not loud enough to disrupt the ceremony, but present enough to be felt. Jonathan noticed movement in the crowd. Small things. People shifting. Faces tightening for just a second too long. He frowned. Then, almost without thinking, he took a deeper breath. At first, nothing. Then there it was. Faint. Unfamiliar. Not strong enough to overwhelm, but distinct enough to register. Something sour. Something wrong. It didn't belong in a place like this. It didn't belong in a moment like this. Jonathan's expression changed, just slightly. Emily felt it. Her fingers stiffened in his. "Jonathan," she murmured softly. He didn't respond right away. His attention had already begun to narrow, his focus sharpening in a way that had served him well in business. But now, it carried a different edge. He leaned in just a fraction closer. The scent grew clearer. And then, recognition. Not of what it was exactly, but of what it wasn't. It wasn't perfume. It wasn't flowers. It wasn't anything clean. Jonathan pulled back just enough to look at her more closely. "Emily," he said quietly, his voice no longer warm. "What is that?" Her breath caught. She stopped, her lips parting, but no words came out. Around them, the ceremony faltered almost imperceptibly. Reverend Collins hesitated for half a second, then continued, though his voice carried a slight uncertainty now. "To love and to cherish, in sickness and in health." The words lingered in the air. In sickness. Emily's eyes flickered with something. Fear, unmistakable and immediate. "Not here," she whispered quickly, her voice trembling. "Please, not now." Jonathan's jaw tightened. He leaned closer, his tone sharper this time. "Then when, Emily? After this? After we say the vows?" A few guests in the front rows had begun exchanging glances. The subtlety was fading. Whatever had been easy to ignore moments ago was now harder to dismiss. A man coughed lightly, covering his nose. A woman shifted further down the pew, creating space between herself and the aisle. Emily noticed. Of course she noticed. Her entire body went rigid, as if she were bracing for something inevitable. "I was going to tell you," she said, her voice barely above a breath. I needed more time." Jonathan stared at her. The words didn't calm him. They did the opposite. "Tell me what?" he asked. Emily shook her head, panic rising in her eyes. "Jonathan, please, just trust me. We can talk about this after. I promise." Trust. The word landed wrong. Jonathan exhaled slowly, but there was no relief in it. Only tension, tightening beneath the surface. Another breath. The smell was stronger now. Or maybe he was just more aware of it. Either way, it was no longer something he could ignore. And judging by the shifting discomfort in the room, neither could anyone else. For the first time since the ceremony began, the illusion cracked. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough for the truth to start bleeding through. And whatever that truth was, it was already too late to hide it. The air inside St. Matthew's Church felt heavier now, thick, almost suffocating. Reverend Collins continued speaking, but his voice had lost its rhythm. Words that once carried warmth now drifted uncertainly, as if even he could feel something slipping out of place. To stand together in truth, and to honor one another without fear. The irony hung unspoken. Jonathan barely heard him anymore. His entire focus had narrowed to Emily. The distance between them hadn't changed, They were still standing inches apart, but something fundamental had shifted. The woman in front of him, the one he thought he knew, suddenly felt unfamiliar. Emily's breathing had become shallow. Her chest rose and fell unevenly, her composure unraveling piece by piece. The faint tremor in her hands was no longer subtle. "Jonathan," she whispered again, her voice breaking. "Please don't do this here." His eyes hardened. "Don't do what?" he asked, low and controlled. "Ask you what's going on?" Emily shook her head quickly, her gaze darting around the room. Guests were no longer pretending not to notice. Conversations had stopped entirely. Every eye was on them now. She leaned in closer, desperation replacing restraint. "I was going to tell you," she said, her voice barely audible. "I just needed today to be normal. Just for a few hours." Jonathan let out a quiet, humorless breath. "Normal," he repeated. "You think this is normal?" Emily flinched. The smell lingered between them, unavoidable now. No longer faint. No longer deniable. Jonathan stepped back slightly, just enough to create space. And in that space, something clicked. Not a full understanding. Not yet. But recognition. A memory. Fragments of moments he had dismissed before, small, insignificant at the time, began to rearrange themselves in his mind. The nights she avoided turning off the lights. The way she pulled away when he tried to get too close. The expensive perfume she wore, heavier than necessary. The doctor's appointment she canceled, twice, without explanation. Jonathan's voice dropped, sharper now. "You lied to me." Emily's eyes filled instantly. "No, Jonathan, I didn't lie." "You hid it," he cut in. "Whatever this is, you hid it." Her silence answered him. For a second, neither of them spoke. The church was completely still. Reverend Collins had stopped mid-sentence, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. Even he understood that the ceremony was no longer in his control. Jonathan's heart pounded, not fast, but heavy, each beat deliberate, echoing in his chest. "What is it?" he demanded quietly. "What didn't you tell me?" Emily's lips trembled. "I was scared," she said. "That's all. I was scared you'd leave." Jonathan stared at her. "That's not an answer." Tears slipped down her cheeks now, uncontrolled. "I tried to fix it," she continued, her voice cracking under the weight of it. I thought it would go away. I thought I could handle it." "Handle what?" Jonathan pressed. Emily hesitated. And in that hesitation, something inside Jonathan snapped tighter. "Emily." His voice wasn't loud, but it carried something final. "Say it." She closed her eyes for a brief moment, as if gathering whatever strength she had left. "When I was younger," she began, her words uneven, "I got sick. It wasn't supposed to last. The doctor said it could be treated, but I stopped going." Jonathan didn't move. "I didn't have the money," she continued. "And then, I didn't have the courage. I thought if I ignored it, it would disappear." The silence that followed was suffocating. Jonathan's expression changed again, this time slower, deeper. "What kind of sick?" he asked. Emily opened her eyes. And whatever he saw in them, it wasn't reassurance. "It got worse," she admitted. "Over time. I just learned how to hide it." Jonathan felt something cold settle in his chest. Hide it. From him. From everyone. "For how long?" he asked. Emily swallowed hard. "Years." The word echoed louder than anything else that had been said. "Years." Jonathan took another step back. The space between them widened. "You were going to marry me," he said slowly, his voice hollowing out. "And not tell me this." "I was going to tell you," she insisted weakly. "I just needed the right moment." "The right moment?" he repeated, disbelief cutting through every syllable. "When exactly is the right moment to tell someone something like this?" Emily reached for him, instinctively. He didn't take her hand. That hurt her more than anything else. "Jonathan, please," she whispered. "I love you." The words hung there, fragile, almost pleading. But they no longer had the effect they once did. Jonathan looked at her, not the way a groom looks at his bride, but the way a man looks at a stranger wearing a familiar face. "I don't even know what that means anymore," he said. A quiet gasp rippled through the front rows. The illusion was gone now. Completely. Whatever this moment was supposed to be, whatever future had been promised just minutes ago, it had already begun to collapse. And standing at the center of it, surrounded by witnesses who would never forget what they were seeing, Jonathan realized something he couldn't unknow. The woman he was about to spend his life with was someone he had never truly known at all. Silence took over the church, but it wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of silence that pressed against the walls, heavy and unnatural, as if the entire room was holding its breath at once. Emily stood frozen where she was, her hand still half-reached toward Jonathan, suspended in a moment that no longer existed. Her tears fell freely now, but she didn't wipe them away. "Jonathan," she said softly, her voice trembling. "Please don't look at me like that." He didn't respond. His face had gone still, too still. The emotion that had been there just moments ago had drained out, replaced by something colder, something distant. "I was going to tell you everything," Emily continued, her words rushing now, desperate to catch up to what was slipping away. "I just needed time. I didn't want you to see me like this, not like this." Jonathan's jaw tightened. "Like what?" he asked quietly. Emily hesitated, then shook her head as if the answer itself was too heavy to say aloud. "Broken," she whispered. The word landed between them like a confession. Jonathan let out a slow breath, but it didn't ease anything. If anything, it made the distance between them feel even wider. "You decided that for me," he said. "You decided what I could handle, what I deserved to know." "I was trying to protect us," she insisted, her voice cracking. "I was trying to protect what we had." "What we had," he repeated, almost incredulous. "Emily, this isn't protection. This is—" He stopped, because whatever word he was about to say didn't feel big enough. Behind them, someone shifted abruptly. A chair creaked. Another guest stood halfway, unsure whether to stay or leave. The tension had reached a point where no one knew how to behave anymore. Reverend Collins stepped forward cautiously. "Jonathan, maybe we should pause." "No," Jonathan said, without looking at him. The single word cut through the room. Emily flinched. "Jonathan, please," she said, her voice lowering again, more fragile now. "We can fix this. We can go somewhere, talk, figure it out. Just not here." Her eyes searched his, pleading for something. Understanding, forgiveness, anything. For a brief second, it looked like he might soften. Then the smell hit him again. Stronger. Unavoidable. It wasn't just in the air anymore. It was tied to her, anchored to the reality he had been trying, desperately, to deny. Jonathan took another step back. Then another. The movement was small, but it changed everything. Emily noticed immediately. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "Don't do this. Don't walk away from me." Her voice rose slightly, panic bleeding through. "You promised me," she added, almost breaking. "You said you'd stay." Jonathan's eyes darkened. "I promised based on what you told me," he said. "Not what you hid." The words struck harder than anything else. Emily's knees weakened, but she forced herself to stay upright. "I didn't want to lose you," she said, her voice barely holding together. Jonathan didn't answer. Instead, his hand moved. Slowly at first, almost unconsciously, toward his jacket. A few people in the front rows noticed. A man whispered, "What is he doing?" Daniel, the best man, stepped forward instinctively. "Jonathan, hey, man, just breathe, okay? Let's take a second." Jonathan didn't look at him. His fingers closed around something inside his jacket. Emily's eyes followed the movement. And in that instant, she understood. "Jonathan," she said, her voice dropping into a quiet, terrified plea. "No." He pulled the gun out. Gasps erupted across the room. "Jesus," someone shouted. "Put it down," another voice cried. Daniel raised his hands. "Jonathan, listen to me. This isn't you. Don't do this." But Jonathan wasn't looking at any of them. He was looking at Emily. And whatever he saw now, it wasn't the woman he had fallen in love with. It was something else entirely. Emily took a step toward him, shaking her head through tears. "Please," she begged. "I'm still me. I'm right here. You know me." Jonathan's hand trembled. For a split second, it seemed like he might lower the weapon, like something inside him might break the other way. Then, the memory of everything she hadn't said, the realization of how long it had been hidden, the overwhelming, suffocating sense of betrayal. It all collapsed into one moment. One decision. "Don't," Emily whispered. Bang. The sound shattered everything. Emily's body jerked backward, then collapsed onto the white aisle, her dress spreading around her like a broken promise. Screams filled the church. Someone dropped to the floor. Someone ran. Someone cried out for help. But Jonathan didn't move. He stood there, the gun still in his hand, staring at her as if time had stopped, but only for him. The world around him blurred into chaos. And at the center of it all, the perfect wedding had just ended in irreversible silence. For a fraction of a second after the gunshot, Nothing moved. The sound still seemed to hang in the air, echoing off the high ceilings, caught somewhere between disbelief and reality. Then, all at once, the silence shattered. A woman screamed. It was sharp, piercing, followed by others, overlapping, rising into chaos. Chairs scraped violently against the floor as guests stood, some stumbling backward, others rushing toward the aisle without thinking. "Oh my God, call 911. Someone help her. Get down, get down." The calm, sacred space of St. Matthew's Church dissolved into panic. Emily lay motionless on the white runner, her body twisted slightly to one side, her wedding dress no longer pristine. The bright fabric absorbed what it could not stop, spreading slowly, unmistakably. Her veil had slipped free, resting just inches from her face. Her eyes were open, but they saw nothing. Linda Carter's voice broke through the noise, a mother's cry, raw and unfiltered. "Emily, Emily, baby, no." She rushed forward, collapsing beside her daughter, hands shaking as she reached out, but didn't know where to touch, what to do, how to fix something that could not be undone. "Stay with me," she sobbed. "Please, stay with me." But Emily didn't move. Near the front, Daniel Harper stood frozen, his hands still raised halfway in the air, as if he were trying to stop something that had already happened. "Jonathan," he said, his voice hollow, almost unrecognizable. "What did you do?" Jonathan didn't answer. He hadn't moved. The gun was still in his hand, lowered now, but not released. His gaze remained locked on Emily's body, unblinking, as if he were trying to make sense of a reality that refused to rearrange itself. Around him, everything blurred, shouting, crying, footsteps, the sound of someone fumbling with a phone. A man near the aisle dropped to his knees, pressing trembling fingers to Emily's neck. I don't feel," he stammered, his voice breaking. "I don't feel a pulse." "No," Linda cried, shaking her head violently. "No, you're wrong. Check again. Please, check again." But the man didn't move, because he already knew. In the distance, faint at first, came the sound of sirens, growing louder, closer, a reminder that the outside world was still moving, even as everything inside the church had come to a standstill. Two men carefully pulled Linda back, though she resisted, clutching at Emily's dress as if letting go would make it real. "Ma'am, please. That's my daughter," she screamed. "Don't touch me. Don't take me away from her." Her voice cracked under the weight of it. Near the entrance, some guests had already fled, unable to stay. Others remained, pressed against the pews, hands covering their mouths, eyes wide with shock. And at the center of it all, Jonathan finally blinked. Just once, as if something inside him had reconnected. He looked down at his hand, at the gun still resting there. Slowly, almost mechanically, he turned it over, studying it like it belonged to someone else. Then, quietly, almost gently, he let it fall. The sound of metal hitting the floor was small compared to everything else. But it carried. A moment later, the church doors burst open. Police officers rushed in, weapons drawn, voices loud and commanding. "Drop your hands. Get on the ground." Jonathan didn't resist. He didn't run. He didn't speak. He simply raised his hands, slowly, his movements controlled but empty, like a man following instructions without understanding why. An officer approached cautiously, kicking the gun further away before forcing Jonathan to his knees. "Stay down," he ordered. Jonathan complied, face pale, eyes distant. One of the officers glanced toward the aisle, taking in the scene, the bride, the blood, the shattered ceremony. His expression tightened. "What happened here?" he asked sharply. No one answered right away, because there was no answer that made sense. Only fragments. Shock. Screams. A single gunshot. And a wedding that had turned, in a matter of seconds, into something no one in that room would ever forget. By the time the sirens faded and the church was cleared, the story had already begun to spread. A groom shoots his bride at the altar. The headline was simple, clean, easy to digest. But nothing about what happened inside St. Matthew's was simple. Detective Marcus Hale arrived at the scene just as the last of the guests were being escorted out. He moved with quiet purpose, his expression unreadable, eyes scanning every detail with practiced precision. A wedding turned crime scene. White roses still lined the aisle. Candles still flickered softly. The organ sat untouched. And at the center of it all, just a few feet from the altar, was the place where Emily Carter had taken her final breath. Marcus crouched slightly, studying the space, then stood again. "Where's the husband?" he asked. "Already in custody," an officer replied. Didn't resist. Marcus nodded. That told him something, but not enough. "What about the victim?" "Body's been transported. ME's on it." Marcus exhaled slowly. "All right, let's start with who she was." Because in cases like this, the answer was rarely in the moment. It was always in the life that led up to it. Emily Carter looked perfect on paper. That was the first thing they discovered. No criminal record. No history of violence. No known disputes. Financially stable. Employed consistently. No red flags that would suggest anything remotely connected to the chaos that had just unfolded. Her social media was curated, but not excessively so. Photos of quiet dinners. Occasional vacations. Smiles that looked natural, never forced. She didn't overshare. She didn't invite attention. She was private, one co-worker told investigators. Nice, but she kept things to herself. "What kind of things?" Marcus asked. The co-worker hesitated. "I don't know. That's the thing. You just got the feeling there was more, but she never let you in far enough to see it." Marcus had heard that before. People who lived carefully. People who edited themselves. He wrote it down anyway. Jonathan Reeves, on the other hand, was easier to understand. Successful. Structured. Predictable. He had built his life on control, on knowing exactly what he was dealing with at all times. "Jonathan doesn't like surprises," Daniel Harper told detectives during his statement. "Not big ones, anyway." "Did he ever mention concerns about Emily?" Marcus asked. Daniel rubbed his face, still shaken. "Not concerns, just questions, sometimes." "What kind of questions?" Daniel hesitated. He said she avoided certain things. Doctors. Physical stuff. He thought it was anxiety or something. Marcus leaned forward slightly. "Did he ever push her on it?" "Yeah," Daniel admitted. But she always had an answer. Not a good one, but enough to move past it. Enough to move past it. Until it wasn't. The deeper they looked, the more gaps they found. Not obvious ones. Not glaring inconsistencies. Just missing pieces. Entire stretches of Emily's medical history were incomplete. Records that should have been there simply weren't. Appointments that were scheduled, but never followed through. Marcus stared at the file, flipping through pages that felt too thin for a life that long. "Where did she go?" he murmured. A forensic analyst looked up. "What do you mean?" "These years," Marcus said, tapping the file. "There's nothing here. No consistent treatment. No follow-up." "That's not unusual," the analyst said. "Some people avoid doctors." Marcus shook his head slightly. "Not like this. Not if something's wrong." The room went quiet. Because now, they all knew something was. It took 3 days to find someone who could fill in the silence. Dr. Alan Whitaker. A name buried deep in an old clinic database, flagged by a partial record that hadn't been fully erased. Marcus sat across from him in a small office, sunlight cutting through the blinds. "You treated Emily Carter?" Marcus asked. The doctor nodded slowly, his expression cautious. "Years ago." "For what?" Dr. Whitaker hesitated. "I need you to be specific," Marcus said. "This case isn't going away." The doctor leaned back, exhaling. "It started as an infection," he said. "Severe, but treatable. The problem was, she didn't complete treatment." Marcus didn't interrupt. "She came in late," the doctor continued. "Later than she should have. By then, it had already begun to spread internally. We put her on a plan, aggressive treatment, long-term monitoring. And she followed it." The doctor shook his head. "For a while," he admitted. "Then she stopped coming." "Why?" "She said she couldn't afford it," he replied. But that wasn't the whole story. Marcus watched him carefully. "What was?" Dr. Whitaker's voice lowered. "She was ashamed." The word hung in the air. "Of what?" Marcus asked. The doctor met his eyes. "Of what it was doing to her body." Silence settled between them. Marcus felt it click. Not fully, but enough. "The smell," he said quietly. Dr. Whitaker didn't confirm it directly. He didn't have to. "If untreated," the doctor continued, "the condition can progress. Tissue breakdown. Internal complications. It's not something a person can easily hide forever." Marcus leaned back slowly, processing. But she had tried. For years. Back at the station, Marcus closed the file and stared at the board. Emily Carter. Perfect on the surface. Carefully constructed. Carefully maintained. A life built not on lies, but on omission. On fear. on the desperate hope that if she held everything together long enough, no one would ever see what was underneath. Marcus spoke quietly, more to himself than anyone else. She didn't think it would catch up to her. No one responded. Because in the end, it always does. The deeper Detective Marcus Hale dug, the clearer one truth became. Emily Carter hadn't been hiding nothing. She had been hiding everything. But secrets like hers don't begin at the altar. They start long before, quietly, invisibly, until they become a second life. 8 years earlier, Emily sat alone in a narrow clinic room, her hands folded tightly in her lap, knuckles pale from pressure. The fluorescent lights above her buzzed faintly, filling the silence she couldn't escape. Dr. Whitaker stood across from her, holding a file he hadn't yet closed. "You need to understand," he said carefully. "This isn't something you can ignore." Emily nodded, but her eyes were fixed on the floor. "I know." "No," he replied gently. "I don't think you do." She swallowed hard. "What happens if I don't continue treatment?" she asked, her voice barely steady. The doctor hesitated, not because he didn't know, but because he did. "It will get worse," he said. "Gradually at first, then faster. Your body won't be able to manage it on its own." Emily's fingers tightened. "And people will notice?" she asked. The question was quiet, but it carried more fear than anything else she had said. Dr. Whitaker didn't answer immediately. Then, yes. That was the moment everything changed. Not the diagnosis, not the treatment plan, but that single word. Yes, people will notice. Emily left the clinic that day with instructions, prescriptions, and a timeline. She followed it for a while. Appointments, medications, check-ins. For a few months, she tried. But each visit came with reminders. Clinical language, subtle looks, the quiet awareness that something about her was different, something that would only become harder to hide. Then came the bills. Then came the isolation. And eventually, she stopped going. By the time she met Jonathan Reeves, Emily had already made her decision. Not consciously, not in one clear moment, but gradually. She would not be defined by what was happening inside her body. She would build a life anyway. And for a while, it worked. Their first meeting had been simple. A mutual friends' dinner. No pressure. No expectations. Jonathan had noticed her immediately, not because she was loud or attention-seeking, but because she wasn't. She listened. She observed. And when she spoke, it mattered. "You don't talk much, do you?" he had asked her that night, half smiling. Emily returned a small, measured smile. "I talk when there's something worth saying." Jonathan liked that. He liked clarity, control, intention. Emily fit into that world almost perfectly. Their relationship developed steadily. No drama, no chaos. Dinners turned into weekends. Weekends turned into something permanent. And through it all, Emily managed. She chose her clothes carefully, fabrics that concealed more than they revealed. She avoided close physical contact when she could, subtle enough not to raise suspicion, but consistent enough to maintain distance. When Jonathan suggested a shared doctor visit once, routine, nothing serious, Emily smiled and shook her head. "I've always hated hospitals," she said lightly. "I'd rather stay out of them unless I have to." Jonathan accepted that, because at the time, he trusted her. But trust, Emily had learned, wasn't something you earned once. It was something you maintained. Carefully, constantly. Every detail mattered. The perfume she wore, stronger than necessary, layered just enough to mask what couldn't be erased. The lighting in her apartment, always soft, never harsh. The way she positioned herself when they sat close together. The way she redirected conversations when they drifted too close to her past. She became an expert at it. At appearing normal. At feeling untouchable. Until the cracks began. One night, Jonathan had reached for her hand in the dark. Unexpected, unplanned. Emily flinched. Not dramatically. Not enough for someone else to notice. But Jonathan did. "Hey," he said quietly. "You okay?" Emily forced a soft laugh. "Yeah, just startled me." He didn't push further. But he remembered. Another time, he had walked into the room while she was applying perfume. Far more than usual. "That's a lot," he said casually. Emily smiled without turning around. "New bottle. I think I overdid it." Again, he let it go. Each moment alone meant nothing. But together, they formed a pattern. One Jonathan didn't fully understand. One Emily prayed he never would. The night he proposed, everything felt right. A quiet dinner. A private setting. No audience. Jonathan knelt, steady, certain. "Marry me," he said. Emily's heart pounded, not with pure joy, but with something heavier. Fear. Because this wasn't just a relationship anymore. This was permanence. This was exposure. This was a promise built on something she had never fully told him. "Say something," Jonathan said gently. Emily looked at him, at the man who had offered her a life she didn't believe she deserved. And in that moment, she made the final choice. "Yes," she whispered. She told herself she would explain. Later, when the timing was right, when things were stable enough, when she had found the words. But time doesn't wait for the right moment. It builds pressure. It closes in. And the longer you delay the truth, the heavier it becomes. Back in the present, Marcus stood in the quiet of the evidence room, reviewing everything they had gathered. Photos, statements, medical fragments. A life reconstructed piece by piece. She wasn't trying to hurt him, one officer said quietly. Marcus nodded. "I know." He looked at Emily's photo again. She was trying to survive. But survival, built on silence, had its limits. And Emily Carter had reached hers, standing in a white dress at the end of an aisle, with nowhere left to hide. By the time Jonathan Reeves sat down in the interrogation room, the adrenaline had already faded. What remained was something quieter, heavier. The room was small, windowless, lit by a single overhead panel that cast a flat, unforgiving light. A metal table separated him from Detective Marcus Hale, who sat across with a file closed in front of him. Jonathan's hands were cuffed, resting on the table. His suit was still immaculate, almost untouched by what had happened, but his expression was not. He looked emptied. Marcus studied him for a moment before speaking. "Jonathan," he said calmly, "I need you to walk me through what happened." Jonathan didn't respond right away. His eyes were fixed somewhere beyond the table, as if replaying something only he could see. "It wasn't supposed to happen like that," he said finally, his voice low and dry. Marcus leaned forward slightly. "Then tell me how it was supposed to happen." Jonathan swallowed. "She was supposed to be honest," he said. The word landed flat. Marcus didn't interrupt. Jonathan exhaled slowly, his gaze dropping to his hands. "I asked her," he continued, "more than once, about the things that didn't make sense." "What things?" Marcus asked. Jonathan gave a small, humorless shake of his head. "The distance," he said. "The way she avoided certain conversations. The way she pulled away." He paused, searching for the right words. "She always had an explanation," he added. "Not a good one, but enough to keep things moving." Marcus nodded slightly. "And you accepted that?" "I trusted her," Jonathan replied. There was no anger in his voice, just fact. Marcus let the silence sit for a moment before asking, "So what changed?" Jonathan's jaw tightened. "That moment," he said. His eyes lifted, meeting Marcus's for the first time. "The smell." The words seemed to carry weight even here, in this sterile room. Marcus didn't react outwardly, but he noted the shift. "What about it?" he asked. Jonathan leaned back slightly, as if trying to put distance between himself and the memory. "It wasn't just a smell," he said. "It was recognition." "Recognition of what?" Jonathan hesitated. Then, quietly, "Something wrong." The room went still. Marcus watched him carefully. "Wrong how?" Jonathan's hands tightened against the cuffs. "Like something breaking down," he said. "Like something that shouldn't be happening to a person." Marcus let out a slow breath. "And in that moment," he said, "you connected it to her." Jonathan nodded once. "She couldn't hide it anymore," he said. "Not there. Not in front of everyone." His voice began to shift, subtle at first, then more pronounced. "I looked at her," he continued, "and all I could think was how long." Marcus leaned forward slightly. "How long what? How long had she known?" Jonathan snapped, his composure cracking for the first time. "How long had she been living like that, standing next to me, smiling, pretending everything was fine?" The words came faster now, sharper. "How long was I the only one who didn't know?" Marcus didn't flinch. "That's what this was about?" he asked. "Being the last to find out?" Jonathan shook his head immediately. "No, it was about being lied to." "She didn't lie," Marcus said evenly. "She withheld." Jonathan laughed once, short, bitter. "That's the same thing," he said. Marcus held his gaze. "Not always." Jonathan leaned forward now, his voice dropping. "It is when you're about to marry someone," he said. "It is when you're about to build your life with them." His breathing grew uneven. "I was standing there," he continued, In front of everyone I knew, everyone who believed in us. And suddenly, none of it was real. Marcus stayed quiet. Because this wasn't about facts anymore. This was about perception. About collapse. Jonathan's eyes drifted again, unfocused. I kept thinking, he said. If she could hide something like that, what else didn't I know? The question lingered. Unanswered. Unanswerable. Marcus spoke carefully. So you felt betrayed? Jonathan nodded. Completely, he said. Marcus studied him for a moment longer. Betrayal doesn't justify what you did, he said. Jonathan didn't argue. I know, he replied quietly. Another silence settled. Then Marcus asked the question that mattered most. What happened between that realization and the moment you pulled the trigger? Jonathan closed his eyes. For a few seconds, he didn't speak. When he did, his voice was softer, almost detached. It all happened at once, he said. Everything I thought I knew about her, it just collapsed. He opened his eyes again. And in that moment, he added, I didn't see my fiancée. Marcus waited. Jonathan's gaze hardened, not with anger, but with something colder. I saw a stranger, he said. The words hung in the room, because they explained everything. And nothing at all. Marcus sat back slowly, absorbing it. Jonathan Reeves wasn't describing a calculated act. He was describing a breaking point. A moment where trust, identity, and reality had collided. And something inside him had given way. But even as Marcus understood the psychology behind it, he didn't accept it. Because one truth remained, untouched by explanation. A woman was dead, and no amount of unraveling would bring her back. Jonathan lowered his head slightly, his voice barely audible now. I didn't plan it, he said. Marcus nodded once. I believe you. Then he paused. But you still did it. And in that room, there was no escaping that. By the time the case reached the courtroom, the country already had an opinion. Not one opinion, two. And neither side was willing to back down. Outside the courthouse, reporters lined the steps, microphones ready, cameras rolling. Protesters gathered in divided clusters, some holding signs that read, "Justice for Emily," others arguing that the truth behind her condition had been ignored. Inside, the atmosphere was no less charged. The courtroom was packed. Every seat filled. Every whisper loaded. At the defense table sat Jonathan Reeves, clean-cut, composed, but undeniably changed. The man who once controlled every aspect of his life now sat confined within it, his future no longer his own. Across from him, the prosecution prepared their case. And at the center of it all, Emily Carter's absence was louder than anything said. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Prosecutor Evelyn Grant began, her voice firm and unwavering. This is not a complicated case. She paced slowly, making deliberate eye contact. A man stood at the altar, in front of witnesses, and shot an unarmed woman. She paused. His fiancée. The word carried weight. This was not self-defense. This was not an accident. This was a choice. The jury listened, still. No matter what he felt in that moment, she continued. No matter what he believed he had been told or not told, there is no justification for taking a life. Her tone sharpened. Because if we allow emotional reaction to excuse violence, then we are no longer a society governed by law, but by impulse. She stepped back, and the room held its breath. The defense attorney, James Holloway, rose slowly. He didn't rush. He didn't need to. Mr. Reeves is not disputing what happened. He began, his voice calm, controlled. He pulled the trigger. That is not in question. He turned slightly toward the jury. What is in question is why. A pause. And more importantly, what state of mind he was in when he did it. He let that settle before continuing. This is not a case of cold, calculated murder, Holloway said. This is a case of psychological collapse. He moved closer to the jury, lowering his voice just enough to draw them in. A man standing at the most important moment of his life, suddenly realizing that the person beside him, someone he trusted completely, had been hiding a life-altering truth from him for years. He gestured lightly. In that moment, his perception of reality shattered. Holloway stopped. And when reality breaks, he added, people don't always respond rationally. The courtroom divided further as the evidence unfolded. Medical experts testified about Emily's condition, carefully, respectfully, but honestly. Dr. Whitaker took the stand, his tone measured. She was dealing with a progressive internal condition, he explained. One that, without consistent treatment, can lead to visible and sensory symptoms. The prosecutor stepped forward. But it was not contagious, correct? Evelyn Grant asked. No, Dr. Whitaker confirmed. And it did not pose an immediate threat to Mr. Reeves' life? No. Grant nodded. So whatever Mr. Reeves experienced, however unpleasant, it did not justify lethal force. Correct, the doctor said quietly. The statement lingered. But the defense wasn't finished. They called a forensic psychologist, Dr. Laura Bennett. She spoke with clinical clarity. What we're seeing here, she said, is an acute psychological break triggered by overwhelming emotional stimuli. Grant crossed her arms. You're saying he lost control? I'm saying his perception of reality fractured, Bennett replied. In his mind, everything he believed to be true was suddenly invalid. And that justifies murder? Grant pressed. No, Bennett said firmly. It explains behavior. It does not excuse it. The distinction was sharp and necessary. Jonathan took the stand on the fifth day. The room fell completely silent. He looked at the jury, not pleading, not defiant, just present. I loved her, he said. No hesitation. I wouldn't have been standing there if I didn't. He paused, his hands resting still in front of him. But in that moment, he continued, I didn't know who she was anymore. Grant stood. Mr. Reeves, she said, did Emily Carter threaten you in any way? No. Did she attack you? No. Then why did you shoot her? The question cut through everything. Jonathan swallowed. Because I broke, he said. No elaboration. No defense. Just truth. In the gallery, Emily's mother wept quietly, clutching a photograph of her daughter. To her, none of this mattered. Explanations didn't change the outcome. Analysis didn't bring Emily back. Across the aisle, a few observers watched Jonathan with something closer to sympathy than anger. Because they saw something else. A man who had not planned to kill, but had still done it. Closing arguments came fast. The prosecution returned to certainty. This case is about accountability, Grant said. Not emotion, not perception, not confusion. She pointed toward Jonathan. He made a decision, and Emily Carter paid for it with her life. The defense countered with complexity. This case is about understanding the human mind, Holloway said. Not to excuse, but to explain. He looked at the jury. Because justice without understanding is incomplete. When the jury finally withdrew, the courtroom exhaled, but not in relief. In anticipation. Because no matter what verdict they reached, half the room would believe it was wrong, and the other half would believe it didn't go far enough. The law would decide Jonathan Reeves' fate. But the question that lingered, long after the trial ended, was one no verdict could fully answer. What do you do with a moment that destroys everything? The verdict came on a gray afternoon. No sunlight, no warmth, just a quiet, heavy stillness that settled over the courtroom as the jury filed back in, their expressions carefully controlled. Jonathan Reeves stood as they entered. For the first time since the trial began, there was something unmistakable in his posture. Not confidence, not defiance. Acceptance. The foreperson held the paper with steady hands. On the charge of second-degree murder, she said, her voice clear but measured, we find the defendant guilty. A soft gasp rippled through the room. Emily's mother lowered her head, her shoulders trembling as tears slipped silently down her face. She didn't cry out this time. There was no energy left for that. Only the quiet collapse of a grief that had already consumed her. Jonathan didn't react. He didn't argue. He didn't shake his head. He simply closed his eyes for a brief moment, as if something inside him had finally settled into place. The judge spoke next, his voice firm, grounded in the weight of the law. Jonathan Reeves, he said, you took a life in a moment that cannot be undone. No explanation, psychological or otherwise, can erase that fact. A pause. You will be sentenced to 25 years to life in state prison. The words landed with finality. A life measured now not by success or control, but by consequence. Weeks later, the media had already begun to move on. Another case. Another headline. But for those who had been inside St. Matthew's Church that day, nothing had moved forward. The memory stayed. Not just the gunshot, but everything before it. The silence. The shift. The moment when something invisible became impossible to ignore. Detective Marcus Hale stood outside the church one evening, long after the case had closed. The doors were locked. The lights inside dim. From the outside, It looked untouched, like nothing had ever happened there. But Marcus knew better. Places remember. He exhaled slowly, his thoughts returning, as they often did, to the same question. Not why Jonathan pulled the trigger. He understood that, as much as anyone could. But why it had ever reached that point. Emily Carter had lived her life in fear. Not fear of death, but fear of rejection. Fear of being seen for what she believed she was becoming. So she built something else instead. A version of herself that could be loved, accepted, chosen. And for a while, it worked. But fear doesn't disappear when it's ignored. It grows. It waits. And eventually, it demands to be seen. Jonathan Reeves had built his life on certainty, on control, on clarity. He believed in knowing the truth, facing it directly, no matter how uncomfortable. Because to him, truth meant stability. It meant trust. And when that foundation collapsed, so did everything built on top of it. Two people, one hiding, one demanding to see, neither prepared for what would happen when those worlds collided. Marcus looked up at the church windows, now dark. They never had a chance, he said quietly to himself. Not because they didn't love each other, but because love alone wasn't enough to survive what stood between them. Silence, fear, and the truth that came too late. Inside a prison cell miles away, Jonathan sat alone. The noise of the facility faded into the background, replaced by something far more persistent. Memory. Not the trial, not the verdict, but the moment before everything broke. Emily standing in front of him, reaching for him, saying, "I'm still me." Jonathan stared at the wall, his voice barely a whisper. "I didn't see you." The realization came too late to matter. In a quiet cemetery on the edge of town, a small headstone bore Emily's name. Fresh flowers rested at its base, placed there by someone who still believed in remembering her as more than the way her story ended. Not as a secret, not as a tragedy, but as a person who had wanted, more than anything, to be loved without fear. A wedding that began with perfection, a love that grew in silence, a truth that surfaced at the worst possible moment, and a single decision that turned everything irreversible. Because sometimes, the most dangerous secrets aren't the ones meant to hurt someone. They're the ones kept just long enough to destroy everything instead.